it reaffirmed for me that my reading of Vatican II, the documents, which we all read in seminary, was accurate,
Mhm.
which made me happy because, um, of course, I'm hearing all of these critiques of Vatican II. I'm seeing that there are some seriously negative fruits that do arise out of it in the Latin world in particular.
We are transformed. We ourselves are transformed by what occurs by the gift of grace.
Mhm.
It's not, you see, there's a kind of negative side to this that pushes it, but it's not just a kind of promissory note that God gives us because he says that we're holy with Christ's holiness. It really is transformative of us. And so, in other words, it transforms our being and it has an effect in us. I think about what it was like for the apostles, actually. The apostles knew the mysteries greater than anyone else by a special charism, right?
Much
But
agreed.
St. Paul only could he handed on what was kind of in a sense it was occasional, right? The different communities that he wrote to,
Mhm.
right? What we get is, it's not as though he didn't necessarily grasp the mysteries he didn't write about, but the ones that got really explicit and handed on were answering vitally these issues of the early church, which providentially were like the essential issues that then, were handed on scripturally.
Welcome to the Searchers of the Lost podcast. I'm Father Nathan Symeon, and today joining me is Dr. Mathew Minerd. Dr. Mathew Minerd, he is a father. He is also a Byzantine Catholic now, for actually some years now. It's been a while since we've been together, but you've been a
Mhm.
Byzantine Catholic for like 6, 7 years now. Yes?
Six, yeah, it was
Okay.
Holy Week of 2018 is one of
Okay.
my canonical work went through at least, yeah.
Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. He's also a cantor. Did I already mention that your father? I did,
Yeah.
didn't I? And he's a professor at St. Sir Methodius Byzantine Catholic Seminary. Dr. Miner was also my professor for moral theology. And if I remember correctly, you said I was the easiest student that you ever had in your class and always look forward to seeing me in every class.
Father Nathan, Father Nathan Symeon, or just at the time Nathan, was one of the ones who pushed me in an eastern direction because I see that you carefully elided. He's also Minard's also a bit of a scholastic translator, but it was iron sharpening iron, which was good. I mean, it was a necessary
Yeah.
thing. Um, so yeah, you were there at the beginning. Whenever I first came, I'd been attending a Byzantine parish for about half a year or a year or so, I guess. And I was going to leave academia whenever Father Christian Kappas called me and said, "Hey, I'm looking for someone to teach." I thought, Lord, I think you want me to go there so I can grow in this Byzantine thing I'm doing. So fine. So yeah, you were there from the start. Back when the Melkites at the time, remember how they how to put it? They didn't it wasn't the best chanting during that period.
Yeah, oh, I remember.
Yeah.
That's how I don't watch this episode. I remember that period. I
Well,
remember I remember one of the priests, now priests, and I won't mention his name, used to actually do this during services. I don't know if you remember that. I don't know if you remember that,
I might be able to guess who it was. A couple
don't
a
try
couple
to.
years later, there was really good. Like during the COVID period,
Yeah.
I remember Father Joel Barstead commenting on
Oh
how it
yeah,
was like it
they
was
got
the
better.
golden era of Melkite
Of
services. He
Melkites,
said then
yes.
after that, and it was so
Yes.
different than those first experiences. But I mean, you know, I, it's tough. It's tough whenever you have two or three guys,
Yeah.
right? So if you don't have some musically strong guys, it's tough. So
Yeah,
anyway, that's
no,
a
it
bit of
is. It is.
banter. Yeah, it's a bit of banter
So
at the
so
beginning,
like I
but
I'd say I started going to Mundelein a few years ago, Mundelein to work on my STL. It was like 2, 3 years ago, and I contacted you. I was talking to you about oh, I said Father Matthew or Dr. Matthew Levering said hi, who I'm taking
Mhm,
right now in a class, by the way. And we
mhm.
started talking, and it was kind of fun for us because you had said I've really come a long way in my Eastern development. And I say, well, I've learned a lot about the Latin tradition, which I appreciate. And so it was kind of like you and I were crossing paths going in the opposite directions of where we started. And so I thought, based on some of our conversations that we had in the past, we could have a really good dialogue about an Orthodox understanding of Vatican II.
Hmm.
And so kind of what sparked my interest and why I wanted to talk to you about this is I remember you and I talking back in seminary about the importance of traditionalists being prepared, priests being prepared to interact with traditionalists when they come into our Byzantine churches, because you were convinced, well, they're going to be doing this. And um and you had even suggested maybe offering a 1 unit course on traditionalism, because you're very well read on this subject. And you thought you could possibly help us along, and I'm pretty convinced you probably could. So I at that time in my life, I thought that I could just kind of my view. I was not yet a priest. I was kind of finalizing my years as a seminarian, and I thought, no, I can just kind of blissfully be Eastern and not have to deal with the infighting in the Latin world. And of course, all of my great dreams and aspirations were shattered when I became a priest. I realized that that's a completely untenable reality. That's just not the situation on the ground. I was being a bit too much of a Gnostic at that point. Living in my own imaginative little experiences, right? And so
Hmm.
um I thought, well, what we could do is we could talk about Vatican II, because that's a hot button issue in the traditionalist world. But Eastern Christians kind of come at this a little bit differently than
Hmm.
than folks in the traditionalist world. And so I thought, I would love to talk with Dr. Minerd about this, because you not only did you come from that Latin world, but now you're also for quite some time now living in the Byzantine tradition, and you're I know very sympathetic, if not sometimes moderately critical of some of the movements within traditionalism, to where you'd be able to kind of help us cast some light on what took place at Vatican II. We could talk about the kind of the more Orthodox strands of Vatican II. We could also talk about where even places where you think maybe need some adjustment or need some correction. I'm certainly open to those conversations. I would say the only conversations maybe we should try to avoid for today, only because I'd love to take them up again at some point, to touch on more current issues. Um, Catholicism and world religions,
Hmm.
Catholicism and Protestantism, and Vatican II. I think those would be other fascinating conversations for the future.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, that gets into the edge of like some of what was controversial at the council. Yeah, what you said too about that time, like whenever I was telling you guys at seminary, like this might be helpful. I mean, I myself was thinking, am I projecting my own experience? I was never a full bore traditionalist, but that's the world I came out of liturgically. I mean, that's liturgically I was attending the traditional Latin Mass. Never quite felt spiritually at home though. Um, but especially you guys who are out on the West Coast, because we were talking about this, so to speak, in the green room before this, a lot of our West Coast communities are highly constituted by former Roman Catholics or people who at least are Western in some way. And sort of the churn of what's going on in the West is very current. But also too, if you're in a more urban area. So, it was another seminarian who was. I mean, do we use names if we're using them positively? Are
I
we
think
allowed to use
positive's
names?
okay.
Yeah. So Father Paul West contacted me, and he grew up in the bubble of what Passaic was like, very Greco-Catholic. But he called me, it was like a year after he was, not even that, maybe half year after he was ordained a priest. And he said, listen, I've got someone. I kind of, wish that we had talked more about this sort of traditionalist mindset, because I want to understand how to pastorally answer this person. Would you be okay with sort of mediating this conversation?
Yeah.
Um, and it's, that's in his case because he's on the East Coast, kind of near a city, and so you just have more dense Roman Catholics, who may be more serious. The Rust Belt's a different thing, right? In some ways, my advice is less applicable to my own parish because you're not going to run into that in Uniontown. Uh,
Yeah.
not the same
Yeah.
way. But yeah, to come to the council, I mean, it is very much like looking in two different worlds when you talk about the Second Vatican Council. From even nowadays, it's changed quite a bit in the last 6, 7 years. A kind of conservative Western approach especially younger Westerners, right, who may not have grown up during John Paul II's era, or at least would have been maybe a little bit more mature during Benedict XVI. John Paul II, Benedict XVI are men of the council, so you see a lot of positivity in that regard, even among conservatives in the West. But nowadays, because of the influence of traditionalism and a reaction to, like, let's just be honest, some of the pot that has been stirred up for the last 11 years, we'll just leave it there. There's a certain negativity toward the council that has grown, or at least a dismissiveness. We sort of have to
Yeah.
leave it behind.
Well,
In the
can we,
East, just to
okay,
make
go
it
ahead.
clear, it's so important for our identity because it
Mhm.
effectively ripped the scab off of all of these ecclesiological issues that were left unstated for us. So, like, we were sort of in a nebulous land. So we experienced the council so differently. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why I chose for the title Orthodox Catholicism and Vatican II.
Hmm.
And by Orthodox, I mean adjectively,
Hmm.
those who are upholding the right faith, the right worship of God. And so in my mind, Orthodoxy can be Latin Orthodoxy, it can be Russian Orthodoxy, it can be Greek
Hmm.
Orthodoxy. They're particular expressions of our worship, but they all need to be rooted in the ancient Christian faith. But when oftentimes my reaction, and this is just to kind of set up the conversation for how we'll kind of go forward and talk about the Eastern approach to Vatican II. Um, Oftentimes when people hear the word traditionalist, they're thinking that the traditionalist is the person who's preserving the ancient Christian faith.
Hmm.
But for me, Orthodox is a better way to talk about that. And part of the reasoning for me is that so often when I meet someone who calls themselves a traditionalist, they're really talking about medieval piety, but more than that, more than medieval piety, especially I'm becoming aware of this the more at Mundelein actually reading the medievals. It's
Uh-huh.
more of a modern
Hmm.
spirituality that they call traditionalist. It's not the ancient Christian faith. And of course, we know, Robert Taft, that famous liturgical scholar, he points this out that in the West, they have so much opportunity to look back at the early fathers of the church. But so oftentimes they just refuse to go all the way back there. They're kind of stuck in kind of a more modern period, which they call traditionalism. Is my hunch somewhere near accurate?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, a good hunch, both for words. I mean, I think that orthodoxy has a just better pliability, right? Because it's right opinion or right belief, right glory, right worship. It kind of combines things, I think, in a way that works. But your general sense too about whenever you hear the expression traditional Catholic, it's very often referring to a certain mindset or phronema, as we were talking about in the green room, that's post-Tridentine and it or very modern at least. Um, for instance, think about how it took a whole century and still they're kind of having trouble with it, but to have liturgical renewal, liturgical spirituality was not at the center of Western piety. This was a major problem that, from the mid 19th century
Mhm.
onward, there kept trying to be a push to deal with this issue. And that's probably part of the reason why things still went up so upside down was because there was so little rooting in liturgical piety that when they changed their liturgy so much, no one kind of knew how to react anyway because the liturgy was just this thing you did on Sunday or in holy days of
Mm.
obligation, right? And that's definitely just not something ancient, like at
You
all,
know,
right?
something
Yeah.
that happened the other day, and this might just kind of give an example to what you're saying. I had a young a guy who's recently coming to our parish, coming from the more traditionalist world, and he asked me if he should be doing something when I'm doing my prayers at the altar,
Hmm.
right? Like he thought he should be doing something outside of the liturgy that's not
Yeah.
part of the liturgy.
Yeah, I guess which is I guess a little which it is. That is it. You'll find Bouyer, who has his biases. He in his liturgical piety book, he does sort of read the riot act to some of this kind of these elements. He tells a story about St. Francis de Sales, who I think is a very pious man, very holy man actually, but nonetheless made some promise to the Blessed Virgin that he'd always pray the rosary whenever he was in choir, not celebrating the mass, if he was present in choir for a mass, which is just striking. Yeah,
Hmm.
that's like that. It's hard for me to imagine that though as a cantor, because as you know, for the cantor,
Yeah.
I've got enough to do. I can't even think about doing something else, right? Especially if it's vespers or something with multiple books. Um, but yeah, that sort of mindset is kind of yeah, is probably in line with that. And it is unfortunate because there is even in traditionalism there are some people who are more liturgically focused. They did kind of take heed of the liturgical renewal stuff that was earlier, at least. Maybe not the stuff from the 20th century, but what usually is thought of, if someone's thinking of American Roman Catholicism that's traditional, it's very often kind of a very modern, even here in America, very Irish. At very best, the German would be that if it's somewhat liturgical. But yeah, you're right that kind of connection to the ancient church, which even if it's starting to dissipate in the 13th century, for example, right, it's still very present in like the writings of someone like Thomas Aquinas, even though the mindset's beginning to change. In the modern period, you don't even have a sense of the importance of it, which is weird because at the same time, though, the theologians are still saying about the importance of the fathers as like the primary locus after scripture and tradition, but it's not lived, right? It is very different. It's super modern. That Bouyer book, Liturgical Piety, have you ever read it?
I have not.
Yeah, I mean, again, he kind of he kind
I'm
of
kind of taking the
shoots.
books that you've recommended like one step at a time. Here's the one that
Yeah,
I
oh,
recommend
yeah,
today that
yeah.
I'm reading. Excellent work, by the way. Really,
Yeah, and
really, really helpful.
there are things in there I disagree with. I mean, people who know my research would be surprised that I'm recommending a book where I'm sorry, not Bouyer, Bouillard
Should
and
I put
his
it
theory
back
of
up there?
dogmatic
So
development.
here's
Yeah.
here's the text.
But Thomas Corina's The Disputed Teachings of Vatican II. It captures really the discontinuity and continuity of the council relatively well, I think, actually. Like it does it in a way that's sort of in the middle, right? So it doesn't have everything I would agree with, but it also doesn't have the nut stuff that you're going to get from a much more progressive reading of the council. And so it gets you into a mindset, at least, that you can see sort of what's the dynamism that's involved with the council, because the council is neither something new nor something completely old. I
Hmm.
mean, it is this act of renewal that's occurring that's actually
Well,
trying to go back into the tradition. So yeah.
what I experienced from reading this is it actually just reaffirmed for me. Um, Now, granted, you just say you don't agree with everything, but we can deal with that in a bit. But what it did for me, at least,
Mhm.
was it reaffirmed for me that my reading of Vatican II, the documents, which we all read in seminary, was accurate,
Mhm.
which made me happy because, um, of course, I'm hearing all of these critiques of Vatican II. I'm seeing that there are some seriously negative fruits that do arise out of it in the Latin world in particular.
Mhm.
Um, but it kind of reaffirms for me that those aren't necessary fruits. Those
Mhm.
aren't those aren't the fruits that anybody was really hoping for if if I'm to take this work as accurate.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
not what they were shooting for.
Mhm.
And so
Correct.
maybe we,
Yeah.
we talk
Yeah.
about some of those principles and why it is that actually the kind of the found at least the foundational principles without getting into the particular documents
Sure.
or topics of dispute which we could do in the future, but just kind of let's baseline this thing. Let's talk about Saint Vincent. Let's talk about John Henry Newman. Let's talk about Resource Mont. Let's talk about um, the neo-patristic revival, which is happening in the East at the same time.
Mhm.
Let's talk about the Melkite relationship at the
Mhm.
council, and maybe just kind of like as a general theme, like why it is that Eastern Catholics just don't have the same dilemma when they're looking at this text and considering it through the lens of a more patristic tradition.
Yeah, the two right, the two watchwords of the council, which everyone always talks about, is the ressourcement side, the going back to the sources, and aggiornamento, right, updating the faith, or making the faith, speak to the modern man, whoever the modern man happens to be. I don't think he's just one man. We experienced the ressourcement in the East in a way that was our primary experience of the council. Whereas the West experience, except we didn't experience it in a way that was totally backward looking. Whereas a lot of the mainline West experience, updating for the modern man, but without some of the roots back into the tradition.
So
But this
maybe,
had been
so maybe,
yeah,
Doctor, could you
yep,
first? We're going to start with ressourcement, which I'm totally okay
yep,
with. Could you just
sure,
explain what that is
sure,
for our
yeah.
audience, and then talk about what you mean when you say that we experienced it differently?
Yeah, and I'll apologize if I'm like my old dissertation director who used to say that all of our economic growth today goes back to the 12th century. I sometimes feel like my narratives tend to get really long, but there had been a growing sense in Roman Catholic theology, especially in the like by the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, that there needed to be a move away from at least some of the elements of the neo-scholastic revival that occurred under Leo the 13th. It had begun to harden in many ways. I mean, a lot of the Roman universities, everything became, kind of about, here's my topic, secundum mentum dive tome. So, whatever the topic is, according to the mind of Thomas Aquinas. It's not the whole story. I could tell a parallel narrative, but it was a kind of zeitgeist and it felt stifling. Um, and in some ways, it was contrary to what Leo the 13th wanted to do, interestingly. It was one of the Melkite seminarians, Mikhail, said to me in passing, you know, in some ways, Leo the 13th is saying, go back before some of this modern and post-Tridentine stuff and go back to Thomas. He said, so you just kind of keep pushing, right? So if it's the beginning of Leo's papacy, you kind of start pushing back, and then you by the time you get to the 1930s and 40s, you want to go deeper into the sources which were important even in the Latin West for their medieval theology, namely to the patristic sources. This actually started though even in the 19th century, the Patrologia Latina and Graecae you're familiar with, right? The
Hmm.
PLPG.
Hmm.
That's like 1850s that Mina is doing that, which is fascinating. I mean, those texts aren't the best critical editions. That's a ton of work. As a translator nowadays, knowing how hard it is, so many of those have parallel Latin translations with the Greek, for instance. Those are just like it's an insane undertaking that a random abbe or cure, got funded and managed to get all these texts from fathers, and some of them are spurious, but it was already like an attempt to go back to the sources and the fathers.
So,
And then there
so
was
just for
liturgy.
clarification,
Yep, yep, yep. I'm sorry, and it is big,
no,
so
no, it's
get me on
okay.
a track. Yeah,
So ressourcement, it means going back to the sources.
that's the simple of it.
The example
Point
that
that I
you
made.
just
Yep,
gave is an
yep,
example of how already in the 1800s, the Latin Church is massively translating, getting a hold of the Greek and Latin texts, and I mean the collection's incredible. There's really
yeah,
nothing like it, right? I mean, outside of what we have now on the internet, what it
yeah,
put together was absolutely incredible.
yeah. And
There's a
then there's
returning to the sources already prior to
and then
Vatican
there's
II.
exactly, and then there's a liturgical return to the sources as well, right? Whenever the Abbey of Salem is founded, it's a bit romantic. Prosper Guéranger, when they founded it, was, he was a diocesan priest who wanted to kind of go back to the Middle Ages in his mind. I mean, it's more like that. But that's, Benedictinism sort of had its heyday in the Cluniac monasticism. So there was a real attempt to kind of dig back deeper into the liturgical calendar and how the readings and everything are structured theologically,
Mhm.
right? And even though maybe a good 20%, I think Father Christian says, or more, is historically wrong, that huge set of volumes, like 20 volumes on the liturgical year, is an attempt to go back to the
It's an
sources in
attempt.
liturgical piety,
And
right?
let me just also briefly mention before we kind of move on to the next period of time of ressourcement, but this is also happening. This is also happening in the Greek East,
Yeah.
right? So if you go to Mount Athos, the Colivadis are beginning to return to the sources. They're beginning to compile, especially Saint Nicholas the Hagurite.
Hmm.
They're beginning to recompile the important spiritual texts of the Greek patristic tradition. Um, Unfortunately, they're mostly blaming the reason that they fell into their wrong direction on the West. But the West is actually doing the same thing as the East. They're both trying to return towards the sources. The West is not blaming the East for their loss of sources. but they're blaming themselves. But the Greek church is also experiencing a liturgical revival. The Catholics, especially St. Nicholas the Hagurite, is encouraging people to start going back and taking more frequent communion, taking more serious the liturgical tradition of the church. So there's this parallel movement
Yeah.
of ressourcement, which will be
Hmm.
important to note for a few hundred years later, which we're about to talk about in a second here.
Yeah. And it's also then important once you get into the 19th or like the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century in both the Greek and Russian churches as well. Right. It might be mixed in a little bit with some of that nationalism, but you have this exact same kind of desire to go back to the sources that's, for
Mhm.
instance, present in Florovsky.
Right.
It's mixed in with a bit of the somewhat true, somewhat stereotyped idea of a kind of,
Yep.
Latin captivity of the Orthodox mind, because of course a lot of Orthodox scholars were being sent to the West to study in Western universities. So it did happen that there was this sort of loss, the westernization of the mind. I mean, he's not totally off kilter, but
Yeah.
it's
Well,
interesting to
usually
see that happen in there.
generalizations do connect with some amount of truth. Yeah. Very
Otherwise,
true.
they wouldn't work. Otherwise, people would
Right.
think it's, false. So especially though in the West, as you come through like, into the 30s, 40s, 50s, there's a real desire to push against the scholastic hegemony. Um, and a lot of my work has been, in some ways, to be honest, to try and um, show some of the validity of that tradition and how it wasn't as close-minded in some authors as people made it out to be. But I also feel like I'm kind of I'm able, I'm an underslept parent, so words escape me, but I'm at least authorized to some degree to also say it's true though that they were a bit closed in on themselves and all talking to themselves about Thomas Aquinas and the history of our thought and our debates in the West, among the schools of thought that are our schools of thought. And so you don't have always authors dipping down into the deep tradition of the West. But when they do, it is actually kind of striking. And there was some great stuff going on in mystical theology. There's great stuff going on in ecclesiology at the time, even among the scholastics. But that some of that stuff does stick out. I mean, there's a reason for the reaction. So after a little bit of a tumult in the 50s, it seemed like maybe this ressourcement movement would be sort of stamped out.
We're talking 1950s now, so we've jumped ahead
1950s.
100
Thank you.
years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then at the beginning of the Second Vatican Council, there's a rehabilitation because John the 23rd, when he's naming theological experts to help in the preparatory stage of the council, a number of people who were ressourcement friendly or focused were included among those involved at the council.
And so it's important that at Vatican II, these ressourcement scholars are a big component in the directive of the documents that we received at Vatican II.
Yes, but that's of course they're more influential in the middle of the council than at the beginning.
Okay.
There is a very broad consensus that's sort of put together. It's not just as though Rome manipulated the whole process and ran everything through the what we call now what used to be the Congregation for Doctrine of Faith, the Holy Office. But the Holy Office had a pretty heavy thumb on the initial documents, and effectively at the council, the fathers revolted pretty early on and sort of said, we're not here to exercise our episcopal conciliar authority to just sort of sign off on pre-started documents. So using those documents, you can see how those preparatory documents still found their way piecemeal into different documents at the council. There were significant debates on the floor about how to change the approach and structure and content of the different documents on the nature of the church, on the nature of the liturgy, on revelation, etc.
So there's just to kind of recap here, and then I want to kind of segue into what's going on in the East at this time. So you have all in Vatican II, you have you have those who are going to be kind of more traditionally inclined, who are going to want to speak in the language. And this is before the documents are written. This is before like the official, like before the council is concluded. Those who are going to want to stick to kind of the neo-scholastic language. You're going to have those who have an interest in ressourcement. And those are those the kind of the two main camps
Well,
that we're going to be working with.
they are, but we have to be careful that within the resource monk camp, and this kind of the apocalypse happens after the council, the unveiling happens after the
Okay.
council. there are those, and this is always a danger actually with resource small, and because there are dangers with everything. So if we've talked about sort of the sclerotic side on scholasticism, sometimes people like to go back and use other sources. They use scripture or the fathers or whatever. They do it as scholastics too to push their own opinions, right? In a way that's ultimately to push an agenda, and you're just using the texts or claims of the fathers and scripture. And it became increasingly evident that within the more resource small focused camp, there were two groups.
Okay.
And those who are in the who know this narrative already are aware how this kind of comes to be solidified around two journals, although it's that's kind of a stylistic way of putting it. There was the Concilium journal, which was the more progressive wing. Some of them eventually found ill footing with the congregations actually, and then there was founded Communio in reaction. So that's the journal that people like John Paul II and Ratzinger and others were, well, then Wojtyla, Ratzinger, and others were associated with. So we tend to think ressourcement anymore. We refer to it as referring mostly to what we could think of as the Orthodox
The good
ressourcement.
guys.
That's it, yeah. Whereas
Yeah.
the other side no longer is thought of as ressourcement because they were never really resourcing. They were never among us, right? uh,
Right, right,
they
right.
went off sort of in a much more progressive and eventually secularized direction that the
Right.
current theological establishment is very, very much full of in the Western world.
Okay.
Western just meaning mainstream European American academia of theology.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Latin West it at Vatican II is going to be more diverse than probably what's going on, and at least in the remembered history of the Orthodox Church at that time. The focus then is this neo-patristic revival within the East. You typically think of names like Florovsky and Lovsky and maybe Bolkagov, who are heading up this new movement around the same time. Most of them are refugees and from Russia, and most of them are also located at the seminary in Paris. What is it called? Saint Sergius.
Saint Serge, yeah.
Yeah. And they're doing the same thing in many ways. They're returning to the patristic sources. They're still claiming within the Colivati tradition that they need to escape the Western captivity. Um, they're also they're following the Russian Renaissance, which is also kind of a move back to the old the earlier projects of Orthodoxy. They're very interested, however, in dialogue with others, much like Vatican II is. So they're interacting with other Christians, Protestants, Catholics, etc. They're having important conversations of how they can bring the patristic sources to the table. They're not interested in Florilegium, like previous Byzantine debates and debates throughout the Middle Ages, such as the Council of Florence Ferrara. They're actually interested in using the patristic sources to deal with contemporary questions and issues, much like Vatican II is doing. So I only say this to kind of for there's two reasons. It's to say, well, look, a lot of what's transpiring in the Greek East and the Latin has a lot of similar continuities. There are some discontinuities, but there's a lot of very similar continuities. And I always like to point out these things because the more that I study both traditions, the more that I've realized that there are very, very similar patterns of interest, such as like revivals and interest in the Theotokos in the 11th century. There's constantly these common interests in Latin. We think the story is often told that we just split right after the
And
church's schism. It's not true. In fact, the
yeah.
parallels they do continue. And so even with this return to the patristic tradition, believe it or not, the East and West are both doing that. But this is also important because I think my hunch is this is one of the reasons why for a person who's maybe steeped in the uppercase Orthodox tradition or the Byzantine Catholic tradition, more recently, at least since we've kind of moved beyond the Latinizations in the last century, we experience Vatican II documents very very differently than uppercase traditionalists do, because our own traditions were actually moving in a similar direction.
Yeah, I actually never thought about it in that way. I tend to look at it very pragmatically because when you look at those documents that are directed to the East or which ecclesiologically deal with the East, it's in the direction of a recovery of your tradition, right?
True too.
That's what we're being told. So
Yeah.
the marching order from the council for us is kind of like structurally resourceful. Like we were just
Well, I
told,
think,
like
well,
in
look,
your
so
practice, yeah. Hmm.
I think you're totally right. I think that's right. You know, the Mikhail and I talk about this a lot as well. If you look at all of the documents that have come to the Eastern churches after Vatican II, they're all telling the Easterners the same thing. Go back to your tradition. Go back to your tradition. But so that's true. But that's true if you care about that directive.
Hmm.
What I'm saying is, even if you're like,
Hmm.
I don't really need to get my marching orders from Rome. I've already got the Eastern tradition. That one I'm not letting go of, right? So even if you're Eastern Orthodox, let's say, um, and you engage with the Vatican II texts, um, most of them are going to seem really quite at home.
Yeah,
Um,
they're speaking in an idiom. This is what I was going to come to. I think you're right. They're kind of like subjectively primed because they're speaking in the idiom of a theology that's more at home from an Eastern perspective,
right,
right?
right, yep,
I've never, I mean, it's so simple. I mean, I've never talked about something that's like right in front of you, you never thought of as something that probably is really dispositively important. Because we just hear the East hears the word of the council with an ear that just it has no barriers to it, right?
right.
I think
Which
the
was
reason I
intentional, right?
never, yeah, well, yeah, it was, but it was also addressing Westerners as well.
Yeah,
And I
but I
guess,
mean,
you
but I
know,
mean,
yeah,
didn't the Pope want to run this council differently than other councils, and that it was
hmm.
supposed to be a pastoral council that's not speaking in the same language as previous councils for this very purpose?
Well, that's correct. Yeah. And you know, it always be careful. This is how, I don't know if you know this lesson, but it's like the professor coming back to teach his former student.
Please
Be
do, please
careful
do.
if you overestimate the language of pastoral, because that is sometimes used as a way of denying the validity of the council. It's only pastoral. That's a very standard move in
Oh, is
certain
that right?
circles. Yeah, so you
I
just
haven't
bear
learned the
that in
move yet.
mind.
I'll have
Yeah.
to learn the move and see how I
Because you
can
know we
maneuver
want to say
with it.
there are doctrinal things of doctrinal import, but in the end, the tone though is much more to kind of pastoral and even kind of theological tone, right? It's much less. And not you know there's some Tridentine documents that are super like theological, like when they get into justification, because that's such an issue with the Protestants, they have to at least, even though it's very scholastic in its method, it's functioning very theologically, even if not pastorally.
I'm gonna guess
But
that might be one of your issues with this book, because that's
well,
definitely an emphasis here.
oh, yeah, and that's I
That
guess
it's a
yeah, I'm just
pastoral
aware of
council.
that as I'm aware of that as just being used to dismiss the council, which Guarino I think would use without worrying. I mean, the big thing is I really am opposed this is a whole different conversation, a different podcast,
Okay.
to the specific ways that Henri Boyard explains dogmatic development. This is that's on the island of theological debates that Minerd like it's close to the inner burning core of Minerd. And that's very kind of important for him. He's more sanguine, but that's a theological dispute, right? Not an issue of dogma or doctrine. So,
And that dispute
um,
really is just if I understand it correctly, the traditionalist thing is all quite new for me, but it's still fun and interesting, and I'm learning a lot from it. So my understanding of that particular dispute which you're bringing up is that we're talking about the distinction between the mode of language and the kind of the truth that that mode is communicating. I forget the precise terminology.
yeah, but and this is exactly the problem because basically what the way that Boyard explains that though is he basically says that like the concepts that are understood better, you know, or at least the notions, let's say not concepts, the notions that are understood better as dogma develops in the mind of the church. Which I always hasten to tell people, it's like just because our explicitness is more doesn't mean we're more deeply affixed to the mysteries than the fathers. But as that understanding grows, it there's still a kind of continuity of the notion. I'm much more at home with like how Newman would express this because Newman's very much concerned with a certain kind of continuity that is a real development, but yet the continuity is emphasized. Bouillard basically says, you know, that the concepts can change over time or the notions can change over time in a way that seems almost too radical. He
So
doesn't
there's
want to. He doesn't think he's doing this. He
yeah.
he clearly says certain things where it's clear he's trying to remain orthodox in his theology, but
Mhm.
the mode of his explanation, I kind of want to push at. But you're, like I said, you're at the tight core of like speculatively stuff I've written on. So you know, I'm
So
gonna
okay, so
like
let's
I
do
my
this.
flags planted. My
I know,
flags
I know. Well,
planted.
I don't want you to have to, I don't want you to have to go down that rabbit hole because
Yeah.
I
So
know
let
you to be a nuanced person, and we can go down many rabbit holes. So how about we do this?
so
Let's jump forward a little bit and go to Pope Paul the Sixth idea that Vatican II is Newman's hour, and
Mhm.
let's consider Newman at Vatican II in light of Saint Vincent of Lorraine, who's a fifth century father of the church, and let's talk a little bit about what is valid versus invalid development of doctrine in Vatican II. Um, and maybe you could help us understand and this is where the term pastoral council, I think, could have some valid significance. Um, how we can understand this council as offering pastoral insight and development of language that is valid versus invalid. Can we talk about all of those things, or is that too much? Is that too much to
I
break off?
no, I think we can do it. We can do it high level at least, which may
Okay.
save us, right? By knowing we
Okay.
have to be high level. I think in many ways Newman is, and I would go back and forth on this over my years as a Catholic, right? But having done this work on dogmatic development recently, I think Newman very much, even if not explicitly, the issues related to Newman's own thought in Newman's own day, which that's, 19th century, are basically just the hovering ghost that's present in the West. Partially because understanding kind of the historical character of Christianity is immensely at issue from 1850 to 1965. Let's just say it that way. That's very much the issue in like the modernist crisis. Um, you can see it if you're talking about patristic revival, right? As soon as you start doing resource small, you have the issue of how Christians aren't just we don't live in a purely sort of Neoplatonic, timeless heaven of the forms, right? We're not in the forms here in history, right? Salvation history involves a kind of dynamism that comes to its culmination in Christ and yet continues to also live in the church in a way that is still living, right? And clearly involves development. It's just an obvious datum of the history of Christianity, right? You look at the early councils, it's clear enough that the controversies are precisely because you sometimes have parties that are more conservative. You could say that the Arians are the ones who are more conservative sometimes because they're wanting to keep a certain language that has to be updated somewhat in order to express the mystery of who Christ is.
Right, just
And
to
then
kind of
the
just to
yeah,
bolster what you're saying real quick. So yeah, so Saint Vincent of Lorraine, who's
yep,
famous of saying that what we should hold to is that which has been taught everywhere at all times by all people, right?
yeah,
So Saint Vincent is incredibly conservative by all
yep,
accounts,
yep,
and yet it's Saint Vincent of Lorraine who talks to us about the development of doctrine and talks to us about false development versus true development,
yep.
and he's writing in the fifth century, and so he absolutely knows without a shadow of a doubt that there has to be some development, even though he's affirming that which has been believed at all times and all places by all people. Well, how can he do that? Well, first, let's just start with the fact that he did that, right? So the council of Constantinople had already added the little phrase about the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father. You also have the Theotokos being included at the Council of Ephesus. And of course, he knows that the word Trinity, which was added in the Council of Nicaea, is an update from Scripture. So he knows that things develop. No one doubts that things develop. The question is, is there? How do we understand proper development, and did Vatican II properly do it?
Yeah. So, and of course, development can happen in different ways, right? There is theological development. There can be development of just doctrine. So think about everything in bioethics. A lot of that stuff is not a revealed truth, even if it's connected to revelation. And then there are the dogmas that we were just talking about, and how they develop. Of course, that's the rub of where then theologians have different theories. But one of the great things in Newman, have you ever read Newman? You read Newman's development of
Mhm.
essay on development, which that's the book he's writing himself out of Anglicanism when he's writing. Um, I think that kind of to get the aim on it, those rules that he uses, those kind of canons that he has, because it's a little bit more nuanced than just the everywhere always. The St. Vincent's canons are a little bit. You want to say, well, you know that you mean always, yes, because yeah, clearly the Apostolic Church believed in the Trinity, but not in those words, right? So Newman lays out different like discernment rules, like how in the end, when you look at the developed dogma, there's a preservation of type. You're talking about the same thing in the end, right? This is still the same reality, even if it's more explicitly known that you're trying to understand, be it about anything in the Trinity or in salvation history, in the economy of salvation, Christ, the sacraments, the church, etc. Um, is there a kind of continuity? It's actually a very fascinating section, the continuity of principles section in there, because he lays out there are all these elements of what Christianity is, right? The way that it's a dogmatic faith, but it's a faith that also calls for kind of theological reflection. It's a faith that is ascetical, that always involves a sense for sin. It has a theory of divinization. It has a kind of sacramental imagination. If these elements are overthrown in some way by a dogmatic quote unquote development, it's a non-development. It's a corruption. Um, and then he speaks about how real dogma has a real power for both like assimilation and continuity. Developed a dogma or dogmatic truth, and a mark of a true dogma in a development is this is something not that weakens the message, but instead renders the truth in a sense even stronger, at least for our day. Right. Again, we don't want to make it sound like we have a more perfect grasp of the mysteries than the fathers did, or especially the Apostolic Church did, but it gives a vitality. It's living today. And so it's enabled to confront the world more today, right? Real development involves not statically maintaining the same expressions and even the same explanations of the mystery. It involves meeting the world today. Think about what it was like for the apostles, actually. The apostles knew the mysteries greater than anyone else by a special charism, right?
Much
But
agreed.
St. Paul only could he handed on what was kind of in a sense it was occasional, right? The different communities that he wrote to,
Mhm.
right? What we get is it's not as though he didn't necessarily grasp the mysteries he didn't write about, but the ones that got really explicit and handed on were answering vitally these issues of the early church, which providentially were like the essential issues that then were handed on scripturally, right? But
Yeah,
like dogma
they're
lived.
like prescriptions. Like these are the persons who are coming to a doctor and saying, "Doctor, heal me because I have an eyesore," and
Yeah.
he's prescribing this particular medicine, but he's not. We're not getting every circumstance that will
Exactly.
possibly arise in St.
Yeah,
Paul.
and it's like, and he's doing it's like these like very special. I mean, Providence really directed like both how those
Of course.
diseases were permitted and how he did them. And I'm just trying to preserve this idea, which you and I agree on, is to like always hold the Apostolic Church up as the highest here.
Mhm.
But the same thing is true with dogmatic development too, that it lives and it exercises, the saving balm that dogma is supposed to be. Right? Dogma is not actually about. Go back to what we said about orthodoxy or tradition, actually. Um, Orthodox presentation of the truths of faith is not really just about presenting kind of traditional ideas or, right, like a system, right? It's about handing on truths, which are truths that measure a way of life for the right glory of God. So that's what dogmatic development, is at its heart. That's the ultimate, we could say, in a very Aristotelian way. It's the final cause. It's the telos of dogmatic development is that greater grasp of the mysteries of faith for the salvation of the world and the glory of God. And Newman gives other kind of guides about how there's like a logical connection, etc. Um, it's very tempting for a lot of kind of naysayers regarding the council to look at some of the negative effects that happened, especially in the West, and say that you see a clear doctrinal break. But when you read the documents, for instance, there is nothing in there that you can't make clear logical connection to even earlier scholastic writers, to be honest, even if it's done more deeply. So these are like marks, and you can look at the rest. You can go to the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology and see my summary of this. Um, but you can go through
We could
these
probably
marks
link
and
that on
it
the page.
helps. Yeah, if you would. I mean, be useful for the readers. I give kind of a methodologically about rules for discerning authentic development drawn from Newman in an article on this. Um, So yeah, I'm not going to trace the rest of them, but it gives you an idea of these are the hallmarks of what real dogmatic development are. Um, and I, then believe this is the case, of course, the council too.
So yeah,
So
so
Newman's
Saint
here in the
Vincent's.
background because this issue of history and the present declaration of the truths of faith is super important. Interestingly, as well, because it is another thing at the council that there is this issue about resolving the general baptismal call and ecclesiological status of all the faithful. Right. So it's not just to say the laity, but sort of to deal with how to understand the hierarchy of right, the way that it serves the holiness of all the people of God, right? The hierarchs and the people of God. So to deepen the church's articulation of that, um, in a very hodgepodge way. This is being discussed nowadays with the synod discussions, the synodality stuff. Um, but Newman was very much concerned from the time of his conversion about the way that the sense of the faithful who actually believe was so super important, for instance, during the Arian crisis, right? And he has that famous or infamous at the time letter about the consulting of the people of God by the hierarchy, like kind of like what is the theological justification for doing that. He writes that to, I think it's someone in York. Um, so this issue of kind of the sense of the faithful is another bit that's kind of present at Vatican II, and it's not that
Mm,
it's only Newman, but Newman is very iconic for it, and so we can say there's a kind of Newmanian ghost that could be said to be present there too. Yeah.
yep, yep. No, absolutely. There's what is the term? The term in the East at this time, which is the exact same concept there, is sobernost.
So yeah, it
You've
is.
heard
Yeah,
this term.
it has some different like it has its own kind of thing that's going on in the Orthodox world, but yeah, there are some people that
But it's
make
the
yeah.
consensus fidelium. It's in other
Hmm.
terms, and you might also call it in ecclesial theory receptionism. But it's the
Yeah.
importance of the faithful as it being involved in this process of affirming what's going on. But
And
okay, so
it was a third rail, and that was a third rail in the West to touch.
let me ask you this. So give our listeners just a
Hmm.
brief analogy of what proper development should look like versus improper development. The terms that we'll find in Saint Vincent's work are going to be permutatio and perfectos. Maybe you could
Hmm.
just explain those two differences and then apply
Yeah.
them to Vatican II and where the question is.
Yeah. So, we could think of to say there's it's like continuous development very often. And Vincent uses this like images from biology. They have their problems, they have their limits, which I also actually discussed in that article. Um, But real development is going to bear witness to the fact that this is one and the same thing that's continuing to develop, right? Like when you see something that's living, that's continuing to live the same life that is the life cycle of that organism. Um, and in some way, I'm putting that there just to qualify so we don't kind of mess up again, making us sound like we know more than the apostles. It's in some way the more explicit passing from what's more I think that I actually personally think this is the best model, passing from what's more implicit to more explicit in its definition and its defined form is what is I think the absolute best model for explaining authentic development, at least when you look at its structure, like what the content of the
Can
development
you have to
is.
unravel that for me because I'm trying to put that together with some kind of analogy in my brain and I'm not coming up with it. From
Yeah.
implicit to explicit.
Yeah, so I mean think about what's said about the word in the Gospel of John, right? Homoousios just says the same thing in a more explicit way. Like when you see it, you're like, oh, that's what I was already thinking before, but it's more
Gotcha.
explicit. Now, an example that some
Yeah.
scholastics use that works in some ways is, the presence of Christ in the Eucharist is a real presence, but it's a sacramental presence. It's quite mysterious. And Augustine, at the time of Augustine, they would talk of it as being a kind of spiritual presence, right? And they were trying to make the point there's a difference between the presence of Christ in glory from his presence in the Eucharist. But you have to develop that, and you look back, oh yeah, that's what was meant at the time of Augustine here. Um, and so okay, here's an example that's more controversial from our perspective, but it's me trying to live in this borderland that I live in, trying to often get East and West to understand each other, like coming slightly different
That we
direction than
live
you
in.
might come
Yes.
from.
No, I
Yeah,
trust me. I live in
we
the same
generally
world.
do.
We're both
Yeah.
there, hanging out in that world. Yeah.
In the West, why did they affirm the stuff with created grace so strongly at Trent? Because the earlier datum that's very clear is we are transformed, we ourselves are transformed by what occurs by the gift of grace.
Hmm.
It's not, you see, there's a kind of negative side to this that pushes it, but it's not just a kind of promissory note that God gives us because he says that we're holy with Christ's holiness. It really is transformative of us. And so, in other words, it transforms our being and it has an effect in us. And
Right.
that's what was meant. But you see, it's more explicit, and it had to be more explicit to prevent, in this case, a certain error that was coming around in Protestantism. Um, so, like, I'm hoping, another example I would hope, and Vatican II is tending in this direction already. So it's an example of how it's involved in this. The First Vatican Council, the Pastor Eternus, right? That's a document we're always worried about in the East, is the one on the Pope. And we're always worried less about infallibility. It's kind of present in the Eastern mindset, but it's above all the jurisdiction stuff with the Pope, right? The
Hmm.
super high, his
Right.
immediate jurisdiction. The development about uh, collegiality and the role of the College of Bishops and the role of the local bishop as not being something just to be infringed on as like branch managers of the papacy. It's present if you look at Pastor Eternus. It really is, but it was made much more explicit at Vatican II to make
Hmm.
clear. I mean, there were people at Vatican I who kind of wanted there to be canons that basically said the Pope, if anyone says the Pope can act against the natural law, let him be anathema. And then the Romans were like, that'll never happen. But it's like, well, no, we want to make the point that there's like you need to hem this in. Well, Vatican II, then, that's an example of it being developed. It's the notion of collegiality is kind of getting into the interstices of what's like very, very, very implicit in some of the language of Vatican I, the hyperpapalism there, and developing it. But that example, I think, from John kind of
Hmm.
captures it the best because I
No,
could
good
see it
example. Good
like a
example.
teacher. I could see it dawn on your eyes because you held it before, you held it after, and yet you're aware of that's putting it more explicitly, but it's the same truth.
It looks
There's a
like we need to
continuity.
clarify
Yeah.
some things. Yeah, I mean that was, that was one of the interesting things even at the Council of Nicaea is the all of the champions of Christological orthodoxy were saying, no, we're just talking about what we already believe.
Yeah.
To them, they were utterly convinced that their Christology was just what they already believed. They just didn't have the words yet.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think it's really healthy to remember that even with your analogy or your example, I'm sorry, of Vatican I and Vatican II and the development and our understanding of the Pope and of the other bishops and communion with the Pope is that we needed to develop some language because something wasn't working out and we weren't living into what already was the faith. Those things were already clearly taught throughout church history that the other
Hmm.
bishops or fellow apostles, that Peter doesn't have some completely separate form of apostolic life than the other apostles, that they're not totally isolated, but we need to figure out a way of talking about this in a way that actually represents the ancient Christian faith as it
Yeah. And
always
it's even
was.
and then it's even there. So it's there from early on and it's like present in like the canons of the West, but it needs to be theologically explicated, then doctrinally and dogmatically explicated. And
Yep. And
that's
I
what
and
the
I'd
council
say and I'd
does. Yeah.
say this is something that is a live issue.
Yeah.
History has not had a conclusion at Vatican II. We're still working
No.
on this
Yep.
issue
Yeah.
among theologians and among bishops, etc.
Hmm.
Um, okay, so maybe we should wrap this up a bit. The things that I think we should probably kind of attached to this video. Your article. Can you tell me the name of it again, and we'll put it on there?
Yeah, if you look at ect.org
Okay.
and look up the dogmatic development article on there, just a
Okay.
starting project, actually, the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology. So
Okay,
we're
so
just
we'll link
actually
that.
starting. So yeah,
I think we should probably link the involvement that there's that page on Melkites at Vatican II.
that would be very good to, even though we
That
didn't
would be
talk
a
about
good
it, I
one.
think it's good for people to kind of jump into that. Yeah. So that's
Yeah.
on Sophia Press. Afterwards, maybe I'll get a couple volumes. I'll text you a
Okay,
couple
perfect.
different volumes that might be good for people to kind of wrap their head
Cool.
around. Sort of like a how to put it, like a wide berth orthodoxy of about Vatican II. Right? We'll kind of
Yeah.
set out some
I
of the
think,
more
well,
controversial
what
stuff,
will
but we'll
also
get a
be good
couple of
is
different, yeah.
Callistos Ware's Cambridge lectures on the neo-patristic stuff. They're so good. Have you heard them?
No, oh, no,
Oh
wait,
man, they're so
are
good.
those the ones that Jack Fiegel?
I don't know if Jack Fiegel has that collection. I'm talking
Oh,
about what is it? The Institute of Orthodox Christian Studies over
uh-huh,
at Cambridge.
uh-huh.
Callistos Ware helped start that program,
Yeah, because you know
and
that
you
there,
can listen to
it,
a lot of those videos for free.
well, you know, a lot of those lectures were transcribed by Fiegel.
Yeah, I know they were. I'm not
Okay,
sure
no
if he
project,
has those
yeah.
ones.
Okay, that's fine.
He might, but you're right. Fiegel has like everything. It's incredible the database that Callistos Ware gave to him.
Yeah, so
Really
that's fine.
incredible.
No, but that yeah, you should link that as well. And I'm trying to think, yeah, because there's this other live issue that's going on in the Orthodox world about how to then approach the scholastics. I mean, we didn't even talk about that. That's like Marcus Plested.
Yeah.
Yeah, there. I'll have to look. I've got
Christo Panagiotis. Have you read his book?
no.
It's interesting. It's a Greek patrology.
Hmm.
So it's like trying to do something like Quasten. Quasten does
Hmm.
from a
Yeah,
scholarly perspective, what Quasten does is way superior. But
sure.
at least from the vantage point of giving like a brief history of the Greek patristic tradition, one of the things that he does is he shows how much scholasticism is there in the Byzantine world, which you just cannot ignore. Um, I though I would say and this would be an interesting conversation to have for sure. I would certainly come down on the side if we were talk about theology and what are the best forms of theology. I would
Hmm.
definitely side with the Eastern perspective that the best form of theology is mystical theology.
Hmm.
Um, but I would say it is much more of a historical Orthodox perspective to say scholasticism is a part of doing theology.
Yeah.
And to deny that is just to cover your eyes blindly.
And so for a way for you to understand me, and I don't know what people are gonna like, they're gonna publicly get to see us trying to finally understand each other. Even some of the scholastics, the most scholastic people I've worked on from the beginning of my work, they basically say the same thing and they don't square the circle completely. I can find essays for
Mm,
you by Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange where he talks about how the notions and vocabulary of the mystics is the highest vocabulary.
I believe
But
it. I
then you have to
absolutely
take
believe
the
it.
next step. You have to take the next step then and say, wait a second, what does that mean about our method? And they don't quite take that step, right? Because the next
Yeah.
step is how does that relativize scientific theology? And that's the step that has to be taken. But that's the one where the Orthodox have, in a sense, have already taken it because mystical theology is, in a sense, is the prime analogate for the Orthodox, and it really should be for just Orthodox theology, right? In the capacious sense of the term.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's and even that though I would suggest that somewhat modern. Because the thanks to the I'm thankful for it because I again I affirm that mystical theology is really the best form because of course you already admitted as much when you said Saint Paul had it down better than we ever will, right? And what you're
Hmm.
talking about there's mystical theology. It's like, well,
Hmm.
he directly encountered God, and of course directly encountering God is the best form of theology. This would be, but we should take this topic up another time.
Yeah, yeah, that's like
And
that's the
it'd be
theology.
fun to
Yeah,
bring
it's
up
the science. Yeah.
Diadochos of Photiki because he actually
Hmm.
distinguishes philosophy and theology in some really helpful ways that I'm not sure if you've ever
I
delved
mean, I
into
have
his
read
work.
him, and I'm wondering because there are quotes that do this that I remember running across in secondary source stuff too. It might have been in Russell's book on Palimism. I don't remember. And I'm like, as you say this, I'm wondering, did I misattribute it to Palamas somewhere? And which he sort of makes some of these distinctions too, but maybe it was in him in Diadochus. So, but
Yeah,
that's
there's some
another
interesting stuff
conversation.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's another conversation because otherwise, yeah, you'll be late for liturgy, and I'll be in trouble as a not only a father but a husband.
Well,
So.
thank you. I do appreciate your time, and it's always wonderful catching up with you. And so
Yeah, this was great.
I hope we do this again.
I hope so too. All
Okay.
right.
God
Thank
bless
you
you.
very much, Father.
All right. Bye bye.